Greetings everyone and welcome to BrickCats. Today I am reviewing the Razor Crest by designer FlyInSpace, distributed by BrickVault. As always, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment, or supporting what I do in any other way you see fit. I greatly appreciate it, and thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with me today. FlyInSpace builds in the MIDI scale, and it's actually quite challenging to pull off a really good MIDI scale model, just because the LEGO system limits how small you can go. The angles become more unforgiving at smaller scales, and in general it's just harder to reproduce some of the details really well. For the FlyInSpace Razor Crest without any substitutions, Bricklink was giving me 3 stores and $140 without shipping and tax, which is around $170 including shipping and tax. Instructions cost $23.99 and are available on BrickVault's website. A link will be in the video description. In my reviews, I offer my opinions on aesthetics and model features, parts issues you might want to look out for, the build experience, the model's integrity, and I close out with my overall impression and pricing information in the conclusion. If you're watching this review, I assume you have bought the instructions or are interested in buying them. I also assume a basic level of familiarity with Bricklink's ordering system and LEGO nomenclature. As always, I only use genuine LEGO bricks, and I always purchase the instructions for myself. I create these reviews for my own personal enjoyment, and in the hopes that my advice will make your experience more enjoyable and or less expensive. FlyInSpace's Razor Crest measures about 12.5 inches long, 7.25 inches wide, and sits roughly 5.75 inches off the display stand here. And there are optional landing gear builds that I chose to skip, but sitting flat on the landing gear, the ship would be about 3.25 inches tall. At the front of the ship, FlyInSpace uses black slopes in various orientations to represent the cockpit, and there's some additional detailing at the bottom with these roller skate pieces here. The cockpit does have kind of an unfortunate bump in it, you can see right here. For better or for worse, this is pretty much unavoidable. Without this part of the cockpit sitting a little bit higher, I think that the rest of the cockpit section would look disproportionately thin, and the profile wouldn't be correct at the front here. I believe another reason for building it like this is that it wouldn't be possible to make the top surface of the bulge flush with the rest of the cockpit section without leaving a pretty large gap underneath. So say this was all one construction, it would have to sit more at a higher angle, and then you wouldn't be able to fill in the little gap here very well. So while the bulge is pretty noticeable, and it's certainly not my favorite part of the model, I think I understand why it's there. And definitely compared with the alternatives that at least I can think of, I think this is the best option. The cannons are nicely represented with some clever use of the stud shooters. And right behind the cannons here, if I can show you a good angle, this area around here was kind of my least favorite part of the ship, only because this is the only place where the sub-assemblies and the angles don't come together quite as nicely as in the rest of the model. So it kind of breaks up what would otherwise be a very smooth exterior, but luckily the cannons do hide it pretty well. These angled sections on the sides are constructed really well, and I really like the inclusion of these 1x1 tan plates to continue the color scheme. They also fit well with these sections in between the wing and the engine here, although as you can tell mine have been a bit fussy and I didn't want to fool around with this too much because these are also a little delicate. But if you build this correctly, which I have not, these would line up almost perfectly. I did have them incorrect at one time, but in various fiddling with this model, they have come out of alignment, unfortunately. There is a built-in hatch on both sides of the ship, and it doesn't fold down more than about right here. There's a clip and bar connection in there to make it stand out just a little bit from the rest of the fuselage assembly. I was a bit surprised to see that the tan stripes on the side, they should be about here, were not included, and this likely would have required some jumper plates and maybe 1x4 tan tiles at an angle here. Personal preference for sure, but I think I would have taken more detail in terms of the color scheme than this slightly movable representation of the ramp. But the rest of the fuselage definitely has some nice texturing with tiles and ingots and things like that. And there is some more tan back here to show some representation of the color scheme. The landing gear and the sails here are shaped pretty well, and these would show where the landing skids would fold up into. Moving to the top of the ship, the escape pod is represented with anti-studs, and that's a nice touch to just break up the outline a little bit. It's not removable or anything, as you might expect. And I also really like this greavling section right behind the escape pods, and this is loose just because it kind of just falls in there. The engines are scaled pretty well lengthwise, but I think this is one area where the difficulties of working in the milli-scale become more clear. So these gaps at the top of the engine are just a product of the snot technique used to create the round shape. These don't actually look too bad from most angles because, I mean, they're pretty much hidden. And at most of the angles, I really think it makes the engine look more interesting just because there's some extra shadow there. The engine intake uses the 1x2 curved slopes clipped onto the octagonal modified plate, and I think this creates a shape that's a bit too elongated for the front section of the engine. And what I mean by that is that this should be kind of just stubbier, I think. Maybe, I mean, it's impossible to do this really with the pieces available, but you know, if this was like, I don't know, 2/3, well, I guess 1.5 or something, instead of 2 studs long, that would be more accurate. But it also doesn't transition particularly well back into the main part of the engine, and the main problem would be extending the main section out by a stud or two, and then still narrowing the engine slightly towards the intake to get the right shape. And then this band of modified tiles with clips should be the thickest part of the engine. I'll put up a little screenshot here, but you can see there's like this bulge right where this is. And I think you could extend this out a little bit more, maybe by using 1x1 plates and then some kind of filler piece to just make it a little fatter. You might have some extra gaps there, but you could probably do it without sacrificing too much in terms of appearance if you wanted to. I really love how these 4 sections in the back come together. It's just really cool to see all the different angles and all the different subassemblies. They meet pretty much perfectly. The underside of the ship is nothing special, and you can see some of the connection points, but in general, due to the various subassemblies construction, it's mostly smooth on the top and the bottom. Also of note, I did have 2 sections fall out because they're not connected with a traditional connection. So the cockpit assembly and this little greavling section right behind the escape pod, they just rest in there, so if you turn it over, they do fall out. And lastly, the included display stand is very simple, and it holds the ship at a nice angle. This model requires 172 elements and 1,228 pieces. If that sounds like a lot, it is. This is a rather dense model. And the model doesn't call for any particularly rare or expensive pieces, which is great. And this means the model's cost is mostly due to the quantity of pieces you need. In addition to the ship, the parts list includes the elements you need for both the stand and the landing gear as well. The hinge plate 1x2 locking with 2 fingers on end and 7 teeth, part 54657 in dark bluish gray, is hidden and can be any color. This is also substitutable with the other variants with 9 teeth, part 44302, 44302A, and 44302B. Odds are this isn't going to be an expensive piece anyway, and it forms a connection point for the underside of one of the rear sections right about here-ish. The 4 1x1 round plates with open stud in dark bluish gray, part 85861, are completely hidden and can be any color. These help form the connection point for these angled side sections on either side of the cockpit. 8 of the 10 brick modified 1x1 with studs on 4 sides, part 4733 in light bluish gray, are completely hidden and can be any color, and these make up the internals of the engines. The other 2 are nearly completely hidden and are part of the exhaust vents at the back here. So any neutral color would probably work, and you only barely see just the edges through the cracks, like right in this corner here. The 2-plate modified 2x2 with bar frame octagonal in flat silver, part 75937, was occasionally quite expensive in my algorithm results. Pearl dark gray is a close substitute, and the old dark gray is also a reasonable substitute. And this forms the connection point for the engine intakes right here. 2 of the 3L bars, part 87994 in light bluish gray, are hidden and can be any color. They form the support for the front part of the engines right here. And similarly, the 2 4L bars, part 30374, are nearly completely hidden at the back of the engine, and the only part you see is the very end of the bar. Let's see if I can show you here. It's kind of in the shadow, but you can only see the very end of the bar right in between that open stud there. So this would actually be an opportunity to add some color to this model. Maybe use a yellow, a red, or I don't know if the bars come in orange, or even pearl gold would probably work. Otherwise, any neutral color is going to be just fine. The 2-plate modified 1x1 with open U-clip thin, part 4085B, are used to make an interesting connection right at the angle where the wing meets the forward body. And I actually wasn't able to get the thin U-clip variation to work, but had better luck with the plate modified 1x1 with open O-clip thin, part 4085A. If you go with 4085A, you should change the color to light gray, as light bluish gray is much less common for that element. And if you build Jirax tie interceptor, it uses the same concept. Basically, you're jamming the clip part of that modified plate into an anti-stud for this slope piece here. 6 out of the 10 hinge brick 1x2 base, part 3937, all 4 hinge brick 2x2 top plates, part 6134, and 2 of the 8 hinge brick 1x2 top plates, part 3938, all specified in light bluish gray, are hidden. And these can be any color, and they're used to support the side panels in the main body. If you're not going to use this model in a mock or a scene of some kind, I recommend leaving out the landing gear, so here's the list of parts you can omit if you choose to do that. And with this many pieces, you will definitely be able to reduce your overall cost using Pick-a-Brick. Orders over $35 from LEGO ship for free, and the handling fees on bestseller and standard elements are waived if you spend over $14 in each category. Here are some of the elements that are typically less expensive directly from LEGO, especially after you factor in free shipping, and all of these elements were available as of early January 2023, but availability does change periodically. And beyond these elements, buying as much as you can from Pick-a-Brick is usually going to net you a lower overall price as the number of elements and pieces goes up. And when collecting the parts for this model, I did note that there's a lot of really useful elements for other Star Wars builds, or even just builds in general. So if you plan to recycle these pieces into your next build, that can help reduce your kind of long-term costs as well. FlyInSpace's Razor Crest instructions contain 770 steps, with each part or subassembly added in each step outlined in teal against a white background. I didn't have any issues with this color scheme, and each step usually has you just adding a couple of pieces at a time, so the pacing of the build is quite good. There are multiple steps on a page, which means you don't have to keep moving back and forth between your computer and the model like you would if there was one step per page. But at the same time, you never get a dozen pieces in a given step that takes forever to move on from. FlyInSpace's models are a bit challenging to build, but thankfully the designer does an amazing job supplementing the steps with notes and photos, showing the correct placement of pieces, angles, and how different subassemblies should connect. There are a few examples here on the screen, and some of the most helpful tips I found were the photos showing how things should look, as well as the pointers on where you can safely apply pressure without things falling apart. But difficulty aside, this is a very fun model to build. I think this took me maybe 7 or 8 hours actually. at my normal pace. And those of you familiar with LEGO know how hard it is to make some of these very subtle off-system angles work, even in larger models. But FlyInSpace packs all of that into a really small package here. And it's really impressive how some of the sub-assemblies come together. The only connections I actually had trouble with, and they still aren't quite right, I mentioned them earlier, are these angled sections between the engine and the fuselage right here. This 2x3 tile is connected in a pretty unique way, but it's not quite right, especially on this side. So it's been a little difficult for me to get it in the correct place because it tends to fall apart when I try and adjust it. I'm sure this is a me problem, of course, and it probably comes down to using different instances of the pieces involved. But this, I think, is one of the trickier connections. And the instructions aren't unclear. It's just a matter of getting everything to snap together correctly. I did not pre-sort any of the pieces, but it probably would have been helpful to have some of the pieces in larger quantities in their own little bag or something. There was only one step I got hung up on, and that was securing the wedge behind the cockpit assembly in step 684 right here. As shown, you put two 1x2 plates here, and the wedge kind of just sits on top of this jumper plate you put in place in step 656. And I was confused because the anti-stub of the wedge doesn't actually connect to the open stud on the jumper. It's oddly too small, so the two 1x2 plates are mostly just to stabilize the wedge from sliding around. I did ask FlyInSpace about this on Instagram, and he was generous enough to confirm that this was not intended to be a traditional stud anti-stud connection. So in the vanilla build, this wedge piece just kind of rests here. However, I did discover that if you simply put a 1x2 plate where the jumper is, right here, this 1x2 plate connects very well to that open stud right there, and then it is a solid connection after that. So now this doesn't move around other than a little bit of rotation, and it's secure. So FlyInSpace did indicate he would make note of this and make him an option in the next update. So FlyInSpace, if you're watching this, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me about that. I really appreciate it. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but this is primarily a display model, and I strongly advise against swooshing it around too much. You'll definitely get a sense for the model's weak points as you build it, but the areas I find myself paying most attention to are these angled sections on either side of the cockpit itself, and the landing gear wells on the bottom here. The assemblies to either side of the cockpit, they're connected way back here, and so this is able to flex a little bit, and as you can see, just the slightest movement creates kind of an ugly gap there. So you want to make sure that that's always in alignment. It's easy enough to pop back in if it gets bumped. The frontmost part of the cockpit, right here, this comes off all the time. And since this cockpit piece just rests in here, and this the front bulge is connected with just a hollow stud, it's kind of weak. So I find that popping off, and luckily, again, you just kind of set it back in there. And usually you have to adjust the side sections again to get it right. And then landing gear wells are only connected with a single hollow stud, so not only do they rotate around, the actual correct placement is to get this hollow stud inside this anti-stud here on the 2x4 piece. So that has the effect of sitting it lower than the bottom of the ship. So if you do try and pick this up, you usually hit this and it rotates or falls off or whatever. Again, not very difficult to put it back. You can pick up this model reasonably securely, paper airplane style like I have here, but moving it around too much makes me a little nervous just because the model is kind of top heavy, and you won't get a great grip on the sides of the fuselage because they're slightly angled. It's also quite difficult for me to get my thumb on a spot at the top of the model where I feel comfortable placing pressure to hold it more securely. So this is definitely awkward because your hand is hitting this section here, which is pretty delicate. And also, I mean, this is pretty secure, but the danger here is that the entire engine might separate just because there's no Technic connection or anything locking that in place. And also when you're switching this back and forth, this has happened to me before. If you switch it too hard, the engine connections can actually break off. Luckily, the engine itself is pretty solid, so it tends to stay in one piece. But yeah, not really a swishable model. The last minor integrity issue I've had was actually with the stand. These Technic bricks that hold the support column aren't secured to anything else, so I found them coming loose from time to time as the column can basically act like a lever and pry this off. And what I mean by that is, if you can see, so the Technic brick connects to these two studs on the bottom, but there's only a 1x2 tile, and it's not connected to either of these slope pieces here. So I think the solution would just be to put a 1x4 tile across all of this, and maybe just add those 1x2 tiles here or something. It looks a little less decorative, but honestly, you're not looking at the stand too much. So that would give at least the Technic brick some extra stability. And the other thing is, I do find this to be a little bit narrow. I think that if it was maybe 4 studs wider or something, or maybe if there was a wider plate on the bottom with some more slopes, that would be a little more comfortable, at least for me. But I have young kids running around that bump my table all the time, so whenever this wobbles, I do get a little bit of heart palpitations and stuff like that. So it's perfectly stable for the normal person. It's just if you are trying to move this on the stand or take it on and off, I do find this to be an issue. FlyInSpace's Razor Crest is a great display model and packs a ton of interesting techniques in a very small space. In going through this review, I kind of felt like maybe this came off as being a little harsh or more negative than I usually am, and I just want to be very clear that that's not the case at all. I thoroughly enjoy this model. The building techniques make it really fun to construct, and while it's certainly challenging, the notes and the extra information in the instructions put you in the best position to succeed. Without any substitutions, Bricklink was giving me 3 stores and $140 without shipping and tax, or about $170 including shipping and tax. Omitting the landing gear shaved about $6 off the total price for 3 stores and $134 without shipping and tax, or about $164 including shipping and tax. Using only the 24 elements I specifically recommended buying from Pick-a-Brick, and still omitting the landing gear, my Pick-a-Brick total was $38 with free shipping and tax included. Buying the remainder from Bricklink, the algorithm gave me 3 stores and $76 without shipping and tax, or about $100 including shipping and tax. That brought the grand total to about $138. And lastly, buying as many elements as possible from Pick-a-Brick, which was a significant portion of those required, 140 elements total. Still omitting the landing gear, my Pick-a-Brick order was $96 total, which included tax and also the free shipping. And then buying the balance from Bricklink required 2 stores and $17 before shipping and tax, or about $29 including shipping and tax. So the grand total there was $125. Instructions for the Razor Crest cost $23.99, which feels a little expensive to me, but it is a great build with a good number of pieces, and the quality of the instructions is excellent. It's definitely a great deal if you get the instructions on sale. Thanks as always for watching my review of FlyInSpace's Razor Crest. If you built the model, you have something to share that I left out, or have a question about something I didn't cover, please leave them below in the comments. Remember to leave the video a like, subscribe to the channel, or follow me on Instagram if you haven't already, and I hope to see you back next time.